There's a much better response. Some of you probably already guessed it. Because if you present somebody with many happening, you're going to start generating confusion disorder in his system. It takes time for him to sort out what's going on. You're trying to stretch out his time. Make it difficult for him to adapt. Stretch him out. Because while you're stretching him out, in the meantime, you do something else, and you have to stretch him from there, too. That, in turn, multiplies your opportunities to get into his gaps, exposed lines, and vulnerable areas. That, in turn, allows you, then, to splinter his organism and develop his disconnecting remnants at all levels, tactical, grand tactical, strategic. In other words, you have envelopment inside envelopment inside envelopment, not only trust in it, you just pull them literally apart. In other words, the inverse Clausewitzian. Any non-cooperative centers of gravity, so it can't function as an organic whole. You can't get a focus and direction. Cope with the coming event. Incidentally, when I talk about tactical, grand tactical, strategic, in the military sense, normally think of tactical up to about when you talk about in terms of levels, up to about division, grand tactical, or nowadays they like to call it the operational level. From division up to army, army group, and strategic army up group to theater and beyond. So when I talk about levels, you see that sense. It's not exactly that they tend to do it in that sense. So now if we glue all that together, we can lay out what I call, in a sense, what we call the essence of the blitzkrieg. It's real. Where they're kind of pulling everything together now. I think somebody I was talking to right after the last break, as a matter of fact, we were talking about this in the campaign. When teams start coming unglued, people start departing the scene and everything else. They don't want to be part of a losing campaign. That's what happens. Talking about that. If you can put that pressure on your adversary and cause him to start coming unglued in certain areas, then he starts losing his allies, and it makes it even more difficult for him to cope. Okay? Got another chart you use it in your own later on. Blitz results. Here, I'm talking about Poland here. You got advance through France and return to patent here. Manchuria, I'm talking about the Russians against the Japanese Quantum Army. Middle East, the Israelis, Russians in 68 against Czechoslovakia. Once again, the Israelis again after they got their act unsuccessful. Russia, winter 41-42. Partial reason for that lack of success. Only partial, the winter weather. There's some more fundamental reason I'll get on to later on. Russia, fall, winter 42-43. Here I'm referring to the Caucasus Stalingrad campaign. And interestingly enough, initially the intent of that operation was to mask off Stalingrad and try to conquer the Caucasus. Instead, Hitler decided he wanted to take Stalingrad. And of course, when they did that, they started going strength against strength, violating strength against weakness clause, and of course the whole thing turned into a debacle. North Africa, 42. Here I'm referring to Rommel against the British. Initially, Rommel had some great successes against the British, but eventually the British, by reading his communications, cut his line of communications, overwhelmed him and did him in, as you well know. And one of the big reasons, of course, initially when they did have the advantage, of course, Hitler was treated as a peripheral theater because he was occupied elsewhere and didn't give Rommel the forces and that they needed in order to do the job. They might have turned out differently. In any case, Russia, summer 43. Here I'm referring to the Battle of Kursk. The Russians got wind of what the Germans were up to through their own intelligence and that. The Germans were trying to pinch out what's called the Kursk salient. And since the Russians knew where the onslaught was coming, either very near or in that Kursk salient, they stashed in there roughly 1.4 million men. And the Germans leaped off with about 750,000. And since they not only knew what the Germans were up to, they had even their initial axes of advance where they were coming from, then they could figure out the way they could adapt too. Of course, the thing resulted in a disaster for the Germans. They lost the Battle of Kursk. That was before you. And then, of course, the Ardennes. That was against Marcel, America. In December, actually December 16, 1944. there were two penetrations. There was a northern penetration and a salient that came in. It was the 6th SS Panzer Army under Dietrich, and the southern sector was the 5th Panzer Army under Wehrmacht commander Manteuffel. The Schwerpunkt was assigned to Dietrich, the 6th SS Panzer Army. They got hung up. The commanders tried to prevail upon Hitler to shift the Schwerpunkt. He did not. By the time he did, in the meantime, Manteuffel got stopped, so the whole thing, they lost their flexibility and adaptability to that. In other words, what you see happening as time went on, we see a more centralized top-down command and control system beginning to exist in the German system. So what's my point? We see in Poland, for example, Hitler levied a general intention upon the German army to carry it out. He did not interfere in operations. For the most part in France he did. Except remember, it did stop the panzers outside of Dunkirk, and of course the British got out of Dunkirk. But as time went on, it began to impose itself more and more in the operational aspect of the war. Until finally we got the Ardennes very deeply involved, very highly centralized command control system. It raised an interesting question. Why did Hitler gravitate towards such a system? Why did he do that? And of course, every German officer that I talked to always came up with the same answer. He did not trust his commander. In other words, his system was based upon mistrust, not trust. Now, if you go back to Napoleon, it was the same thing, in a different sense. Remember, he held a grand design in his mind, didn't trust his commanders. Not only that, he knew what he picked, so for single. Do what he wanted. Of course, politicians don't do that either. You're getting down to fundamentals. And so we see that kind of thing. So if you pick those kind of people, then you have to live with the result. But the key thing is, when you begin to think about it, when you let that all that information wash over your brain, all of a sudden a fundamental truth comes out. All centralized command and control systems are based upon mistrust. Otherwise, why do you need it? Otherwise, why do you need it? They're all based upon mistrust. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have one. Going back the other way. To illustrate, you people have some of the same problem. In Balk's, I use him because he says it so well, articulates it so well. Look at it. Let's pretend you're division commander. Because, you know, you get a little pick of who you're going to get from the personnel people. They're also going to send you what you don't want because you're not going to get the pick of the litter. The other guys have to take the drag. And he said, so what you really are faced with, the people that are good, you want to allow to put them in a long leash. The people who are not so good, you're going to watch them very carefully because they're going to get you in trouble. But what does that suggest? Instead of talking about any one kind of a command and control system, you're talking about a multi-dimensional command and control system. Now, if you have smart electronics, you're going to feed your command and control system. That's hard to do. Instead, you tend to get the lowest common denominator, the one that feeds the people who are going to get you in trouble. Now it tends to become more rigid. Military, all these fusion centers and all that explicitly detailed order. I can cite example after example that's done badly on my head. That's one reason. Another reason is you might want to do it. So that's based upon mistrust because it should be. This guy's going to get you in trouble. Another reason is, even if people are gifted, is you're talking about strategic items like nuclear weapons. You're not going to let a guy, you're not going to give him a lot of freedom of action. He may launch a couple of megatons. That's based upon mistrust. It should be. So you want to keep those kinds of things in mind. When you go to centralized command and control, or very detailed instructions based upon mistrust, because the question is, if not, why do you need it? I mean, there might be good reasons. You have to keep that in mind. Very important. Okay, with that in mind, let's shift gears now and go to guerrilla warfare. This is my most dense chart, just a little bit more than the other. Modern guerrilla campaign. I'll let you read this. Take the time to read it because this is the kind of things that are more closely aligned with you people involved in. Note the first bullet. Capitalize on discontent and mistrust. You know your adversary. You know there's going to be problems there. You want to exacerbate that. A lot of actions taking place here in Easter Honor. Very high political content, you can see. Some of these things I don't recommend for your campaign, though. Why not? Some of the more sharper aspects.
Well, what's wrong with Ross again?
Personally, I like the idea of ambush.
And you do that more than we do. But you see what's going on. Many things are going on here. There's a couple things I want to draw your attention. First of all, remember we talked about the blitzkrieg, or normal, or what I call, what you might say, conventional operations. They tend to be on the destructive appearance. But here you're seeing two kinds of things. They're destructive in one sense, but there's also constructive in another sense. You're trying to build up allies on your side at the same time, build up your system. In particular, I try to make that vivid with this particular bullet right here, where you're trying to do that kind of. Remember what Sun Tzu said, know your enemy, know yourself. He was only 2/3 correct. You have to know your enemy, know yourself, and know those others out there. Those third parties, the uncommitted. And you think about it, in a political campaign, you have that same problem. You have to know yourself, know your enemy, and the people that are going to vote. See, we like to say, well, in the military, there's the bad guy and there's the good guy. There's also other people looking on. If you misbehave, he's going to build up the allies. You become isolated. Now you have a hard time making a take or not take, as the case may be. So in that sense, Sun Tzu only had a 2/3. Know your enemy, know yourself, and the uncommitted third party, potential adversary, whatever you want to call it. Very important. You've got to keep that in mind. I normally bring it out later, but I have to deal with it. We people being in the political business, I should bring it out now, since we're talking about this particular chart. But I think you get the drift of what's going on here. Both a destructive and a constructive effort. Destructive, where you're trying to make your adversary so he can't play, destroy his stability, build up yours, and suck the people over to your side. Looks pretty good to move. Makes sense. So then, when you begin to look at it, you say, in a sense, and here's the essence of a guerrilla campaign. You have the destructive part here, and the constructive part here. In some sense, we had problems in Vietnam because we were going to handle out a few trinkets and good stuff that's going to establish a line. That doesn't work. We got to really get in there.
There's a language problem.
Language is a big problem. That's correct. Very big problem. And the intent's very simple. And of course, the implication. They can penetrate their adversary's moral, mental, and physical being. Very little. Get right in there. Generate those. At the same time, they build up their moral, mental, and physical stability. So you both have both the destructive and constructive effort. So if we look back, let's tie a few things together now. Remember, we talked about the 19th century capitalism, military revolutionary strategy, modern guerrilla campaign. Pull it together, what's that underlying strategic philosophy? Sort of redundancy or summation here. I really can't overemphasize it. Think of it this way too. You all have certain friends. You know, when you're with somebody, you get to share their experience over time. You know, there's certain delicate things you don't say. They're going to We all know that. Just mentally say that's forbidden territory to talk about it, bring it up. It's just something automatic to do. Well, then turn the argument around. You know, your adversary try to find out those hidden things in a delicate way. Bring it out so he comes unglued, and then you lever it. You don't want to see like you're a party if you got to come out so he does it to himself. It looks like your party food will also destroy your own moral. You really can't morally isolate somebody. That's very important to know. In politics, you well know, in one sense, you want to isolate your adversary and build up your support. And likewise, don't have that happen. Basically, that's the danger. But there's three aspects of isolation: moral, mental, and physical. You can physically isolate somebody. Military knows that. Mentally, you can isolate somebody, which we'll say later on. Morally, you can't. He has to isolate himself. I'll get into that later. You really can't isolate. He has to do it. Of course, you can set things up so he dives into it. That doesn't count. You really can't do that. He has to do it. Okay? Now, here's an insight. We're always talking about support of the people. What the hell does that mean, have support of the people? Let's take that on. Get a deeper appreciation. In fact, you people probably already do, since you're in the political game, some military people can pick it up. Implicit connections are bonds. Implicit connections are shared experiences or shared values we're talking about. You have to be able to blend into the emotional, cultural, and intellectual environment. You can't stand apart. It doesn't work. You've got to get right in there. You're breathing and thinking and seeing the way they do. That's why they put people in to do that. Because when you do that, then you become one with the people. You do have those implicit connections or bonds. In this sense, what you're doing, then the people's feelings and thoughts become Guerrilla's feelings and thoughts. So you can build up the way they think. And remember what I told you earlier, if you have too sharp an ideology, what's going to happen? That's going to inhibit that process. You've got to be able to see it from their viewpoint. Once you understand that, then guerrilla feelings and thoughts become people. In other words, you can start working the fact, then so you can start getting them going your way. It takes time. And the result, if you do it correctly, guerrillas become indistinguishable from the people while the government is separated or isolated from the people. In other words, they have nothing to run. They can't figure out why they lost. Then they all start pointing fingers at one another, which we're still doing over Vietnam. The military is blaming the Congress. The Congress, they don't know who the hell they're blaming, and people out there trying to figure out who's at fault. And the veterans are coming back and says, we got screwed. Look around. It's happening. Remember, you've seen the thing is that you've heard Weinberger make a statement. We're not going to another campaign without the support of the people. And we laid out those 6 points, or whether you're going to have one of the key ones. First, you have to have an aim or goal, and there's some other ones there. But also, we're not going to get into another goddamn military operation without the support of the people. Well, if that's the case, then we had every right to go in Vietnam because the people did support that operation when we went in. But they didn't later on, and that's the key question. Why not? So on that basis, we had every right to go in Vietnam. You go back and read the literature at the time we went in here. They support American people. Of course, they lost it. Good question. Why? We don't like to answer that question. There's a good reason. We don't like to answer. I'll get into it later on. Just hang on.
How do you defend against that?
Pardon?
How do you defend against that?
I'll get into it later. All in fact, we're almost here. I'm laying it all blitzkrieg and Guerrilla. We're later on to go to counter blitz and counter Guerrilla. Right now I'm just shelling it all in one direction. Okay? So then, if you look at it, if you look at a guerrilla campaign, or political campaign, and note what I say here, not only demonstrate government, Mr. Adversary, road government influence, but cause government to alienate itself from the people. You know how we don't understand? We say the people are alienated from the government. That's not true. The government literally alienates itself from the people. That's what you want. Alienate itself. And of course, the other side is to bring support of people use it. Don't alienate the people. The government alienates itself from the people. Remember what I said. When you're talking about alienation, in fact, I'll give you 3 code words here. If you're talking about cutting or severing lines of communication, in a sense, you're talking about disconnection or separation. They call it severance, I like the word separation. If you're talking about mental isolation, physical isolation, you're talking cutting lines of communication. Code word, disconnection or separation. If you're talking about mental isolation, can anybody give me the code word for that? No. Disorientation. When many isolating, it's disorient. The code word for moral isolation, alienation. Now the military, you go back in history, they're always talking about cutting the guy's lines of communication in a physical sense, but they don't really come to grips with the mental isolation or the moral isolation. Remember what I told you, physically you can isolate somebody, mentally you can, morally he's got to do it to himself. Get back. Okay? Let's look at some results here, real results. It's incomplete list. American colonies. Here we fought the redcoats, down here we became the redcoats. We're in full circle. Okay. I don't want to go through all of them. Unsuccessful. Philippines. We're talking about Philippine insurrection turn of the century. We did some interesting things here when you read the history. Too bad we didn't learn from it. We start out badly, but then some people start thinking, hey, this is stupid. We got to change our act. We made it pay off. South Africa. This is the Boer War, the British. Caused the British enormous problems. And in a sense, I really put it in the wrong column. In a sense, it should be over here. Because even though the British got the Boers to sign up for the armistice, the only way they could do so is by giving them some very easy terms, and the Boers got their independence later on anyway. So in a sense, that's a misnomer, only because they signed up for the armistice. We're familiar with these. Greece, just toward the end of World War II and beyond. Philippines. And here, the Philippines is an interesting case. A gentleman by the name of Ramon Magsaysay came on the scene about 1950. With about 2 years, turned a disaster into a victory. Almost going down to 2. He was a very gifted guerrilla leader. Note the word, guerrilla leader. You know what he was? He was a guerrilla working for the government. He used their techniques against them. Against the guerrilla. So we see that, of course, with the Milan experience. Okay, with that in mind, let's see a sort of a common theme that creeps up between the two, the essence of it. First of all, you don't necessarily go for the battle. I'm not saying you should avoid all battles, but that shouldn't be your preferred solution. Avoid the battle. Instead, you want to cut out his organic integrity indicated by the statement. You've got to penetrate his system, subvert, disrupt, or seize those connection centers, etc. that allow him to operate his organic whole. You exploit these quality. The idea is to generate surprise and shock and reproduce it over and over again. That in turn allows you to roll up or wipe out those isolated or disconnected debris in his system. And if you think about that, the intent then becomes a natural consequence of all that. That's what you realize. That's what you realize. Breaks, police, paralyze them, collapse. Incidentally, I'll show you an example of this connections or centers. I left it out of the book. Israeli example, 1949 by Alienation. same idea there. Okay? So it raises a rather interesting question. Why have they been so extraordinarily successful? Their tactics they have. And here's the message and the underlying idea. I'll let you read it very quickly and then I'll comment on it. Once again, let's invert the argument. Let's assume